to speak about some most recent developments in the ecumenical life in Ukraine. I think you had a little bit of history, and without history, you cannot really move around Eastern Europe. I would like to focus on last couple of years. Like the principal topic of my presentation will be the reaction of different ecumenical players to the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Yes, you had this major event, the new church came to being. What does it bring to the ecumenical life in Ukraine? How the other churches react? How the churches outside Ukraine react? So I will focus on this last couple of years. I will use a bit of presentation if I can share my screen. Can I do this, Roman? Okay, thank you. Okay, can you see my screen? Wonderful. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, you can see. I can see.
You can see the presentation, not the Word file, correct?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I would, you had Tomos, yeah, speaking about Tomos. Tomos in Greek means a document. And from one day to another, Tomos became the most popular word in our country. Everybody was looking for Tomos. What is Tomos? Tomos is a document by which like a national or regional Orthodox Church is recognized as independent. On the slide, you see the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Patriarch of Constantinople, now Istanbul, Bartholomew, who is signing this document. Yes, and then on my right, in the up above, you see the Patriarch who is giving this letter, this pergamon to Epiphany Dumenko, the Metropolitan of Kiev, the new head of this church. And below you have a picture from Ukraine when the new Metropolitan Epiphany is standing near the President Poroshenko on what was called the Tomos tour. It was like a combination of election campaign of the president and the tour to present this document of Autocephaly. Now, with this Tomos, Ukrainian Orthodox Church became part of the Federation of the Orthodox Churches. In front of your eyes, you see the list of the autocephalous churches of Ukraine, autocephalous churches in the Orthodox world. Autocephalous in Greek means self-governed. So you have the longer list is the list of patriarchates the churches who are ruled by the patriarch. Yes, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem. Rome was one of those 5 patriarchates. You remember Father Oleg Kingi showed you a little map with those patriarchates. And you have some patriarchates which were established a little bit later, so which are not ancient. Russia, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Georgia. Now, although the dates of the 4 last one, some Serbia is indicated 1219, Bulgaria 927, Georgia 466. Those autocephalies were in a way lost and only rediscovered in the 19th century or 20th century, together with the other churches. So it was the age of nationalism in a way, of a nation state, which led different Orthodox churches to become independent. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine is the last, yes, in the list. Now, the establishment of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine became an important event and had some effects both in Ukraine and internationally. You heard about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. There is another conflict which is going on in our world, which is the conflict between Moscow and Constantinople. The Patriarchate of Constantinople is the oldest, is not the oldest, it's the most senior, if you want, Patriarchate in the Orthodox Church. It has a primacy of honor. Patriarchate of Moscow is the most numerous church. So you have, in a way, a clash between history and, on the one hand, canon law, in a way, theological prestige, and on the other hand, you have Moscow, which is the most numerous, probably the richest patriarchate. Certainly, the patriarchate with a lot of geopolitical influence. While Constantinople is Istanbul today, so the patriarch himself has probably around a dozen of parishes in Constantinople, some parishes in Greece, some other in the so-called diaspora. Those parishes are nothing numerously as compared to what Moscow has. Now, Matthew was noticing that there is no presentation anymore. Yes, I will show it again in a while. I have only some slides, so perhaps it's fine if we don't need slides, not to focus on that. Now, this conflict between Constantinople and Moscow, in a way, which is an internal Orthodox conflict, has, if you want, influence, impact on what is going on beyond the Orthodox world. In a way, when the autocephaly independence was granted to the Church of Ukraine, the other players, the other denominations, the other ecumenical institutions, yes, in Ukraine and abroad, were almost forced to choose, yes, were drawn into this conflict. They needed to choose the side. Are you with Moscow or you are with Constantinople? You are with Ukraine or you are with Russia? And it was a choice in front of Catholics, Protestants, but also in front of big ecumenical organizations, in front of the Holy See as such. An uneasy choice. Now, I will, in the first part of my lecture, I will try to show you how this new Orthodox Church was received by other Ukrainian churches. And the short story that most of the churches received Orthodox Church of Ukraine very positively, with the exception of the church that is in unity with Moscow Patriarchate. So I will try to explain why this positive reception took place. And I will focus particularly on the relationship between the new church and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Not only because the school is run by an institution affiliated in some way with this church, but also because it's the biggest non-Orthodox church in Ukraine, also with a global presence. In the second part of my lecture, I will speak about the international level. So how this independence of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, how the break of communion between Moscow and Constantinople, how is it seen from big international ecumenical players? And I will show that on the one hand, it is a huge problem for the ecumenical dialogue, because the Catholic Church, for example, speaks with all the Orthodox churches. If the biggest Orthodox church in the world quits the dialogue, the Catholics really are left with the remaining part of the Orthodox, which is not very funny. On the other hand, this conflict between Moscow and Constantinople is a threat to the dialogue in big international bodies. The World Council of Churches, the Conference of European Churches are all suffering from this conflict. At the end, I would like to be able to show maybe some opportunities which the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine offers for the ecumenical dialogue in general. Now, I am well aware that for many of you, especially of those who are not from Eastern Europe, some concepts are unfamiliar. Maybe some terminology is unfamiliar. So don't hesitate to raise your hand, maybe even to intervene vocally and interrupt me, putting your microphone on, if you don't get something or if the term I'm using is complicated. That's really a challenge for me to speak to such a diverse audience. So I prefer you interrupt me rather than I go into the field you cannot follow me. Okay, so don't hesitate to interrupt me. Now, context. I think three pieces are important to understand the context, and I am almost sure from what I have had was said by Professor Hrycak, by Taras Kurelets, by Oleg Fihas. I think you grasped or hopefully grasped some of that context. So I think that part of the context to introduce this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine is, first of all, the pluralism, religious pluralism, not to say confusion in Ukraine. The second piece of the context, I think, is the material out of which the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was created. And the third point piece to the context, I think, is this role of the existent Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which was canonical, which is called Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, Ukraine is a majority Orthodox country with some Catholic presence of Latin and Greek Rite and vibrant Protestant communities. I think that it's now clear, and you remember this as a mantra even when you are waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, regarding the Orthodox, it's more complicated. Since the 1990s, we have had, until 2019, we had 3 big Orthodox churches in Ukraine. Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So this church is a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. It has a certain autonomy, or as they call it, self-governing status. And this church was the only church that was officially recognized by the other Orthodox, and this was the only church with which the Protestants and the Catholics at an international level had relationship. The 2 unrecognized, uncanonical churches were Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate and Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. Now, the first question which would rise when you hear about the Orthodox Church of Ukraine being granted independence, the first question is, why not the first one? Why not the canonical church is being granted independence? Why the other 2, who were called schismatic, who were unrecognized by the world Orthodoxy or other churches? And this is an interesting question, and perhaps with no easy answer. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the new Orthodox, was formed, yes, only in 2018 with the church number 2 and number 3, yes, with some bishops and several hundreds of parishes from the first church, from the canonical church. Now, the fact that this church obtained independence is, in a way, almost unexpected. On the one hand, it's true that Ukrainian Orthodox looked for independence for maybe longer than a century, yeah, or we can say maybe from 17th century. But the fact remains that this church was created from the 2 unrecognized churches, and the recognized church, the official church, remained almost outside the process of recognition. Domestically, the reason for this fact is, I think, the war. I think it was Professor Hrycak who introduced you to the war in Donbass. On the map you see, yes, Ukraine, which over last 7 years has lost Crimea and has lost parts of eastern territory, yes, in Donetsk and Luhansk region. Now, the war has a religious element to it. Two unrecognized churches were run from Kiev. The canonical, the official Orthodox Church, was run from Kiev, but being part of Russia, of the Patriarchate of Moscow. This church, the official church, tried to keep a sort of balance and neutrality within the conflict, which is a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And this church wasn't very successful in it. In a way, the conflict, the war, led to an, in a way, intensification of the process of unity within Ukrainian society. And it forced Ukrainian civil society, academic society, other players to push, to distance themselves from Russia and Russian influence. There was a fear that Russia would use and uses the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, as its soft power. And this church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is part of Russian Orthodox Church, didn't manage to prove that it's fully independent from Russian influence. In a way, the choice in front of the official Orthodox Church was either to embrace Ukrainian nation building project, or in a way participate in Russian imperialist endeavor. So this church, although it's considerably Ukrainian in its character, and many faithful and clergy and bishops feel Ukrainians, they were not capable to convince the political elites, other churches, civil society, that they are immune to Russian influence. As a Russian Orthodox theologian, Cyril Hovorun, says, the Russian Orthodox Church and this Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they refused to acknowledge Russian aggression and instead systemically used euphemism to describe this Russian aggression. And this policy was dramatically contrasted with the policies of other Orthodox churches in Ukraine. So is this I don't know, political introduction and connection between religious and political clear? Okay, I assume that it is extremely clear. Now, let's go to see what is the ecumenical context for the creation of this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Yes, so as I said, it was the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine was created from two pre-existing ecclesial structures. Yes, these structures, the Patriarchate of Kiev and Autocephalous, Ukrainian Orthodox Autocephalous Church, already had a history of ecumenical relations. Although the new church was created very recently, it was created based on two structures, two churches that have been pre-existent and had been present in Ukrainian landscape. One of the forums or fora where this church was very active was the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. Now, you discussed this institution with Taras, so I won't focus very much. A couple of data. It was created in 1996 and it has 16 members. churches and religions and even some organizations, for example, Ukrainian Biblical Society. As Taras told you, on the one hand, it's an important and perhaps unique examples of ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, because it meets often, it has never stopped from functioning. Even if the churches quarrel among themselves, they are happy to be able to be part of this organism in order to lobby their legislation, to fight for traditional values, etc. And I don't know, have some privileges in terms of tax exemption. No ecumenical conflict can dissuade churches from looking for tax exemptions. So it has been an important promoter of ecumenical dialogue. At the same time, one can question whether it's really an ecumenical dialogue, what that is happening there. Because you would question why the churches meet only when they need to lobby something in front of government, why they don't meet to have some ecumenical dialogue or interreligious dialogue of their own, or discuss, I don't know, spirituality, prayer, or the sacraments. I think it's a good base. It's an important and effective base for dialogue, but it's an insufficient platform. What you have in this All-Ukrainian Council of Churches is replicated to a certain degree on various regional levels. Maybe not as an effective council, but as, in a way, informal communication. A mayor, a governor of a region will invite bishops and senior clergy to meet and discuss certain issues, to react on certain events, etc. Roman Fihas, yes, like the godfather of our ecumenical school, he will probably represent us in a couple of days when the Ecumenical Council of Lviv region will be created. But it's also the same style. It's the government that invites churches to meet at the governmental, if you want, territory, to be able to have dialogue of churches with government, not as much churches among themselves. So, even if we say that this framework is insufficient as a theological instrument.
Just a question.
Stephen, were you asking a question? I'm sorry, I missed that.
I'm asking a question. Just some clarifications. You say that the government invites the churches to have some dialogues. So are they okay? I just want to know if they are always censoring the conversations. So I just want to know, are there maybe limits of conversations, or are they censoring communications once the churches are in conversation?
Thank you for your question, Stephen. I don't know whether you will have a paper on Maidan, a lecture on Maidan, Roman. Okay, so I don't want to cover the material that some of my colleagues will be explaining. I think the churches usually are pretty free to say to the government what they think. So if they disagree with government, they will say this. For example, we have an example when the government was meant to sign like Istanbul declaration on, I think, family violence. The churches opposed. When we had this Maidan revolution, or revolution of dignity, yes, whatever, 7 years ago, the government was about to repress and was repressing protesters. The churches protested. So I think the churches in Ukraine are pretty free to disagree with the government. There might be some pressure, but if the churches are internally free, they will they will always resist. We haven't had cases of bishops or senior clergy jailed for their opposition to the government. And it works both ways. Even like very pro-Russian bishops, we had bishops who, for example, were against Ukrainian rights to self-defense in this military conflict, who were calling soldiers not to go and serve in the army, and who would repeat some separatist messages which like would be unlawful under Ukrainian law. They wouldn't be jailed. So there is, I think, a lot of tolerance to what the clergy can say. I'm unfamiliar with any like instances of censorship. Pressure, yes. Governmental attempts to influence church policies, yes. Censorship, I'm unaware. You will have a paper on more on church-state relations during the Maidan, the revolution time, and I think you can maybe go deeper into this to see the precedents. Now, if Father Roman can remind me how much time do I have left?
You have 25 more minutes.
25 more minutes, okay. Hope Jesus gives us, you the patience, and me the power to do another 25 minutes. Now, this All Ukrainian Council of Churches, why is it important? Because it gave the various churches of Ukraine familiarity with one another, cooperation. You know, the chiefs, the senior clergy can exchange their phone numbers, can exchange some conversations. They know one another. They're not afraid of one another. So when this new church was created out of two pre-existing structures, in a way, this the knowledge of how to be in dialogue with the others was there. Yeah, those two pre-existing structures, Patriarchate of Kiev and Ukrainian Orthodox Autocephalous Church, they had experience of at least domestic ecumenical dialogue. Huh? And this means that the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, it's not like entirely new, for good and for bad. Now, what this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine declares, how do they see their own ecumenical dialogue? In his enthronement address, yes, so we are in February 2019, Epiphanius, who is the chief of the new Orthodox Church, said that the church is open to cooperation and dialogue with other Christian churches of Ukraine and abroad. They were already in dialogue in Ukraine. They were not in dialogue with abroad. So it's an opening. It's a challenge for them. I think probably days, if not weeks after creation, the new chief of the church met with the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Some months later, in the same year, at the end of 19, this church created a huge commission for inter-Christian relations. And some, like senior hierarchs, became part of this commission. Now, I showed you this slide. Beforehand, we have the new Church of Ukraine, which is created of, yes, those two unrecognized structures, Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate and Ukrainian Autocephalous Church. And I told you that two bishops from the first church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is a self-governing church, two bishops and a number of clergy passed from this officially recognized church to the new church. Now, what do you think? How many, what is the percentage of representatives of all three churches in this commission for dialogue? So Ukrainian Orthodox Church gave 2 bishops to this new church. Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kiev Patriarchate gave, I don't know, perhaps 80 bishops to the new church, and Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church gave perhaps 20 bishops to the new Orthodox Church. So how the percentage will be distributed in terms of ecumenism? Okay, I won't torture you. I will say that the majority, more than half of the members of this ecumenical commission of the new church come from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was part of the Russian Orthodox Church. So although they are a tiny minority within the big church, the majority of them make this new ecumenical commission. Why is that? Because this is the only church that had experience of international ecumenism. As Taras told you that Russian Orthodox Church is not very ecumenical, and he's right, but they were the only church in Ukraine who had international exposure, who had international contacts, who had the possibility to send their students to study abroad in the Catholic, Protestant, other establishments. So it will take time, perhaps, and for this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine to gain some independent ecumenical dialogue. Now, what is the relationship between the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Catholics, in particular the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is the biggest Catholic Church in Ukraine? So I think we need to have like several major factors. First of all, like in the 1990s, the Orthodox and Catholics in Ukraine have been fighting among themselves. Yes, Taras explained to you that Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was banned. So when in the 1989 the church started to be legalized, Ukrainian Catholics wanted to take over the churches they possessed, yes, prior to 1946, to the Second World War, which were taken from them in 1946, given to the Orthodox. After 40 years, they have an opportunity to take back the churches from the Orthodox and set an Orthodox protest. Yeah? So you have a conflict between Catholics and Orthodox, which probably went through all 90s until early 2000. Yeah? And the black and white picture here on the slide is like a picture from what happens when the Ukrainian Catholics are legal again. Huh? They're a powerful force. The second aspect to understand in terms of relationship between the Catholics and the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine is the fact that the Ukrainian Catholic Church has their own ecumenical position. They have the concept of Kievan Church, of church with the center in Kiev. They say that all the churches who have their origin from Saint Vladimir, yes, and you have another picture of Saint Vladimir, all of Volodymyr in Ukrainian, all churches who have their baptism from Saint Vladimir are somehow connected and a part of one ideal, if you want, church. The Church of Kiev, yeah, the modern capital of Ukraine. And I will tell you a little bit more about this concept. The sad part of the context is how this church relates, how the Ukrainian Catholics relate to Moscow and to Constantinople. Now, the fact that I mentioned at the very beginning that in a way they create, if you are a church, a Catholic church, and you need to decide whether you enter in relationship with the new church in Ukraine, this choice is also the choice which has a political component. It's the choice between are you with Ukraine and its civil society, or you are with Russia. And it's also an, if you want, a ecumenical geopolitical choice. Are you with Moscow or you are with Constantinople? If you are with Moscow, then you keep relations with the traditional official Church of Ukraine. If you are with Constantinople, you enter in relationship with the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine. The picture you have here is the picture of a group, of theology group, between Ukrainian Greek Catholics and theologians from the Patriarchate of Constantinople. The dialogue which existed in 1990s is unexistent now, but in a way it provided a constant line of cooperation between Constantinople and Ukrainian Catholics. So when Constantinople created this new church in Ukraine, this also helped Ukrainian Catholics to recognize it, because they were already friendly with Constantinople. Okay. Few words about this church of Kiev, or Kievan church. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church said that they see their ecumenical dialogue as a dialogue between the heirs, the churches that belong to the baptism of Saint Vladimir. Now, they call this the Kievan Church, or Church of Kiev. Now, this church is, I call it imagined community. It doesn't exist as a juridical structure. Yes? You have several churches who belong to this, if you want, tradition. Is it a Ukrainian church? Is the ethnic element is what unites this imaginary community or imagined community? Is it historical element that unites all those churches? This is an open question, and I'll show you the complexities a bit later. So some scholars say, oh, if you speak about the churches of Kievan tradition as the most important part of the identity of Ukrainian churches, by making reference to Kiev, you exclude Russians. You exclude the Russian church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is present in Ukraine and which belongs to the Patriarchate of Moscow. So some say this concept is a nationalistic concept which tries to exclude Russia. One can argue that to a certain, that's a possible reading. However, here you have the tree, unfortunately it's in Ukrainian, the tree of, if you see the yellow roots and yes, the blue trunk of this tree, this is the early origins of the Kievan church. And what you have in red are all the churches like that are speaking Russian, or who received their their Christianity from Kiev and then moved to Russia and they received their Christianity from Russia. For example, like the first Christians on American continent, yes, in Alaska, they received their Christianity from Russia. Some of like Finland's Orthodox received their Christianity from Russia. On the green part, you have all the Ukrainian jurisdictions that are somehow associated with Ukraine. So you have both, if you want, Ukrainian-speaking, Finnish-speaking, Japanese-speaking Christians who in theory belong to this Kievan church, who are coming from this Kievan church baptism of Saint Vladimir. So this concept of Kievan church, if you make an accent, say this is a Ukrainian church identity, then you limit yourself, if you want, to the green part. Yeah? And you say, okay, all the Ukrainian churches are this imagined Church of Kiev. But if you want to be more generous, you say, okay, also the Japanese Orthodox Church, which was, if you want, evangelized through Russian missionaries, and Russian missionaries have their Christianity from Kiev. The Japanese also belong to this Kievan church. So it's, if you want, a complex concept. Now, I told you that relationship between the Patriarchate of Moscow and Ukrainian Greek Catholics was a bit tense. And you see, since the Moscow position was not to recognize the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, if Ukrainian Catholics would have a better relationship with Moscow, they might have opted, or at least be more receptive to the Russian side of the story. But the relationship between Ukrainian or Greek Catholic Church and Moscow Patriarchate wasn't very good. Moscow Patriarchate was usually very critical toward Greek Catholics. They never digested the fact that Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church moved their headquarters from Western Ukraine, Galicia, from Lviv to Kiev, or that it created new dioceses in central Ukraine, that this church, Ukrainian Greek Catholics, supported the revolution of dignity. So there was a moment before the war in Ukraine when the relationship improved a little bit, but it didn't last very long. During Havana meeting between Patriarch Kirill and the Patriarchate of and the Pope of Rome, Pope Francis, is the meeting of, you have the Patriarch of Kirill who is seated and exchanges the Havana Declaration with the Pope Francis, and the standing person is the Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, who is the responsible for the external church relations in the Patriarchate of Moscow. So Pope and Kirill signed a common document where they called the conflict in Ukraine, if you want, a fratricidal, a civil war in Ukraine, in other words. They didn't use the term civil war, but like the term fratricidal war implied that it's a war between Ukrainians and Ukrainians, which is a Russian narrative. Yeah, Russia says you have a civil war in Ukraine. Ukrainian state, Ukrainian churches says that's not a civil war. That's the struggle between Ukraine and Russia. So if you want, the document says this is a civil war, means Russia is in a way innocent of the conflict. If you say this is an international conflict, it's not a civil war. So you have this political element, and since the Havana statement by Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill used this terminology which was considered by the Catholics as a little bit ambiguous, the Ukrainian Catholics criticized this document. So this is all about context. Ukrainian Greek Catholics wanted to be neutral when this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine appeared, and they say that the Ukrainian Church, Ukrainian Greek Catholics, would abstain from taking their sides. You have the document on 2015, which is called Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's Ecumenical Position, which says Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church does not claim to hold a definitive or defined position as to the specific time and manner in which Ukrainian Orthodoxy might achieve autocephaly, considering the resolution of this question to be an exclusive competence of Orthodox churches. So the Catholics say, okay, you Orthodox, you need to decide among themselves who is canonical jurisdiction, who is not. We want to be neutral. But this general context, which I tried to explain, made it happen that Ukrainian Greek Catholics were rather opened to welcome this new Orthodox Church. They say, we are neutral, we talk to both churches, to the new church and to the old church. Was this done for nationalistic purposes? Is it because Ukrainian Greek Catholics seen another Ukrainian church said, okay, we are happy, they're Ukrainian patriots, or was this for some ecclesial, ecumenical reasons? Now, you have scholars who dispute the fact. Like officially the church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, said that they support autocephaly, the independence of the new church, because this is important aspect of Ukrainian sovereignty. So that would be a political reason. At the same time, the Major Archbishop Sviatoslav said that, but since we would like to have ecumenical dialogue with the Orthodox, Moscow Patriarchate is not very interested in ecumenical dialogue. This new church, it will be official, it will give us the possibility to have ecumenical dialogue. That's why, hurrah, thanks God, we have a new partner for ecumenical dialogue. So you have, if you want, two reasons, yes? Political and the ecclesial. Now, this church was created in 2018-19. Did the dialogue between Catholic Church and Orthodox and the new Orthodox Church advanced very far? The question is no, it didn't. From the very beginning, the churches said, yes, we would like to create a roadmap. We would like to cooperate in academic dialogue, in theological dialogue, in social service. This didn't happen. COVID might be one of the reasons. Maybe there are other reasons, and I will suggest one of the reasons. Like an important, I think, fear on the Catholic side was that this new Orthodox Church will become the state church, will become a de facto official church of Ukraine. I told you about the Church of Kiev, which is in a way imagined church, yes, imagined community. This imagined community has a cathedral, which is a museum. It is a church of Saint Sophia, the wisdom of God, in Kiev. The big important events at the start of this new Orthodox Church of Ukraine were happening in the Church of Saint Sophia, which was the historical cathedral, but which is now used as a museum. And a possible reading for why this church remains a museum is that because the Christianity in Ukraine is divided, so no one should have this church as their property, because several different churches are claiming that they belong to the tradition of Kiev. So when this new Orthodox Church started using this cathedral, this church, the head of the Greek Catholic Church published a document which was called Our Saint Sophia, and he said, none of the churches that are heirs of this church, so means the ancient Church of Kiev, can alone take up the ancient cathedral of the wisdom of God, Sophia of Kiev. So it's possible that for the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine to use the cathedral was a sign, oh, now we are the big Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Now we are the representative of Ukrainian Christianity. This church should stop being museum, should belong to us. And the head of the Greek Catholic says, no, no. Wait until we are all reunited. Now you cannot say that you represent all the Christianity of Ukraine. We also belong to this imagined Kievan church. When from being imagined it will become a real church, then we will celebrate in this church. I think there is also, it's not only ecclesial, if you want, question. I think that there is also a political question. In this way, Greek Catholics, in a way, protested that the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine will become a de facto state church, Ukrainian, or at least the representative of all the Christians. So it would be, in a way, a copy of a Russian model of relationship between church and state. Yes, in Russia you would have one big church which is in constant dialogue with the state. So I think this concerns about the new Orthodox Church becoming the state church, yes, was something that was in a way focused in this conflict about Saint Sophia Church. Yes, in the East, the symbols are important. Symbolic cathedral, I think, had this very meaningful, like semantically very rich content. So the Catholics protested against the fact that this church will become a church state. Are there any questions about this Catholic position and reception of the Orthodox? And I will then go more briefly toward the Protestants. Or we don't have time.
Pavlo, 2 or 3 minutes in order to conclude, and afterwards we'll have more conversation in smaller groups.
The Protestants in Ukraine were very isolated. The majority of the Protestants in Ukraine are Pentecostals or Baptists. So they are not traditional Lutheran or Reformed churches, which have had for many, for decades, if not a century, dialogue with the Catholics. in the, I don't know how about how is the situation in Africa, in other European countries, or North America. In Ukraine, the Baptist Pentecostal tends to be ecumenically uninterested, unengaged. So for them, the question would be a strange question, whether they should dialogue with this question or not. But you had this revolution of dignity. You had the Maidan, and Maidan created such a space of dialogue in which the Ukrainian Protestants felt more engaged in what is going on in Ukraine, more much more engaged. Therefore, they embraced and started dialogue with the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine. They had the same reservation as the Catholics. They said, since this new Orthodox Church called themselves the single or the only one local Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they said, for the church to be the only one, you need to find room for the Orthodox and the Protestants, for the other Orthodox, for the Catholics, the Protestants. You can't call yourself the only church. Now, very briefly, a minute on three other big ecumenical players. World Council of Churches. World Council of Churches is the biggest ecumenical organization in the world. Yes, more than 350 member churches. Is this this organization, in theory, can receive Ukrainian Orthodox Church as its member? For this, the Russian Orthodox Church and other Orthodox churches will be consulted. This would give this new Orthodox Church a table, a seat at the table. So it needs to be seen whether this body accepts the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or not. At European level, you have Conference of European Churches, which has less members, but it's also very important for European dialogue at an ecumenical level. Will this church take Orthodox Church of Ukraine as a member? This church didn't apply for membership, but they will occasionally, and we'll see what will be the answer. Yes? The third player is the Holy See. Vatican, on the picture you have the Pope Francis and the Cardinal Kurt Koch, who is the president of Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity. Until now, there have been no signs that the Vatican will, in a way, acknowledge the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but eventually they need to take side. And we'll see what will be their reaction. Just to end, Heraclitus, yes, a Greek philosopher, said that war is the father of all and king of all. And some he has shown as gods, others men. Some he has made slaves, others free. The war in Ukraine and the conflict, the war between Moscow and Constantinople, has changed so much Ukrainian ecumenical situation. And if you want ecumenical situation, dialogue between the Orthodox and Catholics, Orthodox and Protestants in the world, that it's really something that is worth reflecting and discussing about. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for a dense paper.